The paths in Honkai Star Rail don't matter, or at least the vast majority of them. I know Preservation and Abundance Path have their own niches in which they're really good, and they pretty much specialize and are essentially the only way you can heal or use a shield to preserve your team. But outside of those two paths, and technically speaking a buffing path like Harmony, Destruction, Hunt, Erudition, and Nihility don't necessarily have a set way they're going to be played, or at least don't necessarily have any indicating factors as to what they are as a whole. And now I know the immediate comparison is Hunt is essentially a single target DPS, whereas Destruction is AoE, whereas Erudition is follow-up attacks. But my question to that is, what's the point in having any one of these paths when there really is no sort of specialization in them or value being brought to the table as a result? The only limited 5-star Erudition character we have is Jing Yuan. Outside of that, we have Himiko. And yes, they both use follow-up attacks, and technically speaking, the AoE they have is quite nice. And even the follow-up attacks they do have, especially in regards to Himiko, are quite nice. But there isn't necessarily a point in a character like Jing Yuan having a follow-up attack when realistically all this amounts to is most of his damage being delayed until a certain number of turns after he makes his initial action. Because most of his damage is from Lightning Lord, and as a result, a lot of his damage isn't from him personally using a skill point. This becomes an issue when you take into consideration that Destruction has essentially the exact same AoE, but without the limitation of a follow-up attack being followed or required behind it. Now, Himiko and Herta both use follow-up attacks to a degree, but theirs are a lot less restrictive in terms of when they happen. With Jing Yuan, because his follow-up attacks are essentially the only way he's dealing damage that makes him a worthwhile character, it's kind of a situation to where yes, you can pick him up, and yes, he may perform quite nicely for you. But the damage that you're waiting for is delayed, and the amount of damage you're dealing with is determined by how many skills you use before his follow-up attack happens. And yes, they can be mitigated by having a Branya or high speed or using his ultimate, but still, nonetheless, the amount of damage he's dealing is directly tied to that Lightning Lord attack. And because of that, the question then becomes, what benefit is there to having a character use follow-up attacks in that way? If you're an MOC and you're fighting off against the first wave of enemies, and all those enemies die off, and let's say at that time, Jing Yuan's Lightning Lord is at its maximum stacks. When the next wave starts, Lightning Lord is then pushed back. It doesn't take an immediate action. Now, you can mitigate this by, let's say, using his ultimate, but at the same time, you're not getting any additional stacks as a result. Characters like Blade don't necessarily have this issue, and yes, Blade is an Erudition, he's Destruction, but he also uses a follow-up attack. And so at that point, my question is, what benefit is there to there being a follow-up attack mechanic in that way? I can see the value and point in a character having a follow-up attack after maybe an ultimate or a skill. Yanqing, for example, whenever he uses his ultimate, there's a chance for a follow-up attack to occur, which allows for additional energy regen and a chance to freeze the enemy. That's nice, but the majority of his damage isn't locked behind that. Destruction characters have the same AoE as Erudition characters, except none of the prerequisite restrictions required. You use Dan Heng, hey, 3 skill points done. You use Blade, 1 skill point every 3 turns, and he has an AoE on essentially every one of those basic attacks after that, even his ult. Clara's counter may not have an AoE, and I can't really speak too heavily on her. I don't have her, unfortunately, but she does still have the ability to take more turns and actions if she's being hit. Meanwhile, Nihility is kind of in a weird place because it's debuffs sometimes if Silverwolf and Pela counts, but then you also have damage over time with someone like Sampo and Kafka, which means it can kind of be a specialized debuff-oriented class. Perfectly fine, great. But the 3 primary DPS classes, Erudition, Hunt, and Destruction, are kind of in a weird spot because what is really the point in having an Erudition character be a DPS? And I think Jing Yuan is a poor example of an Erudition character. I think he could have been Destruction, it would have been perfectly fine. I feel like Lightning Lord is a perfectly fine mechanic. The issue is, why is it a follow-up attack? Because it being a follow-up attack and it having a separate section of stacks related to its amount of damage mean that he's arbitrarily going to perform a bit more poorly than somebody like Blade or somebody like Dan Heng, anybody who has an AoE that they can actively apply, and even single target units. Hunt characters being single target oriented is fine. I like Yanqing, I like Sealy. Sealy's a single target character regardless of circumstance. But when your Destruction characters don't really have a downside to being AoE, it kind of makes Hunt seem obsolete. Why would you go for a single target when you could just have an AoE? And yes, skill point consumption may be an issue, but that's really only an issue with Dan Heng because Blade uses 1 skill point every 3 turns. You're liable to have an abundance of skill points with him that you can otherwise slot into another support. And Destruction characters are so self-sufficient in a lot of scenarios with Blade and with somebody like Clara that it makes the investment of Hunt characters seem a little bit much by comparison. I'm not saying Sealy's bad. I'm not saying Yanqing is bad. I like a lot of these characters, don't get me wrong, but I am saying that Destruction is in a very good spot right now. The light cones are all good. The characters are good. Every destruction light cone is essentially swappable onto another destruction character to really good effect. Blade is extremely tanky, and that works to his benefit, and he restores his own HP. And so when you're dealing with mobs in MOC that have the ability to reduce your defense, like the little fire dragon, pinball things, whatever they are, then a destruction unit who can attack all of them equally is going to fare a little bit better than your single target hunt character who has to decide, do I go for the enemies who are reducing my defense or the main boss who is dealing damage, because your supports aren't really dealing damage. And so I like the idea of paths. I want them to be more fleshed out, but we've gotten Blade, we've gotten Dan Heng. Next, Jing Liu is also destruction. And so we're filling out the destruction roster very nicely, but Hunt by comparison is being left in the dust, and then Erudition died after Jing Yuan's release. I like the idea of paths. I like there being more nuance to their kits. I like some of them being more supportive based, or maybe some of them having more differences and scenarios in which they're more valuable than others. But in multi-wave content, your ability to essentially clear out these characters and these enemies as quickly as possible is valuable. And hunt units having high single target damage is great. Destruction units having high AoE that can be acted on pretty quickly is great. But Erudition relying on follow-up attacks to deal a big chunk of damage isn't as good, especially when, if we're looking at Topaz for example, she might be good for buffing follow-up attacks, but then at that point, you're getting another character to buff follow-up attacks for another character when you could otherwise just get a hunt or destruction character and have that same effect. I want Erudition to be better, but it's very difficult to vie for that when destruction is in such a good spot right now. And I want the roster to fill out, but it's also been a couple months into this game, and we're kind of getting the roster settled as of right now. And if every character is stronger than the last, I'm concerned. That was a mini tangent. I like Abundance being a path as it is. I just hope and wish that Abundance characters maybe could deal a little bit more damage to make them not necessarily a DPS loss on your team, but a bit more viable in other circumstances. Same with preservation units. But for Nihility, if it's just a debuffing class, great. If it's just a damage over time class, great, keep it that way. Same with Harmony. Yukong is technically a sub DPS, which is nice and fine. She actually deals relatively decent damage. But Erudition, Hunt, and Destruction are in such a weird spot because there isn't necessarily a differentiation. Sealy is not AoE. Sealy's damage is entirely single target oriented because either way you break it, you have to do single target damage to additionally try and deal damage to another character. Hey, you have your Resurgence, that was still all single target damage. She technically has a little bit more of an AoE once she gets to E6, but that's E6. And so if your single target characters are dealing as much damage as your destruction characters in single target situations, I feel like that's a problem. Because just as much as we could easily say Sealy has less restrictions on her kit and has less situations where she doesn't work, the same can be said for destruction units. Yes, destruction may perform better in AoE scenarios, but if your destruction unit, let's say Dan Heng, is equal to your Sealy in single target scenarios, why would you not go for Dan Heng when for the most part they're using similar amounts of skill points, and for the most part your destruction unit will perform better in any other situation that is not single target, because your Sealy will have to use one skill point for her skill, one skill point on that Resurgent, she uses her ult, then she uses another skill point on that Resurgent, that's 3 skill points. Your Dan Heng, arguably at E0, will also use 3 skill points and then an ultimate. And so they're using the same skill points, and in Sealy's case, she had to kill one enemy to move to the next, to kill one enemy to move to the next, whereas Dan Heng, his 3 skill points were used to hit all 3 enemies. There is no difference. And if Sealy's damage is single targeted to the point to where, yes, it's a heavier hit on one opponent, cool. But if you have to defeat all 3 opponents, or if all 3 opponents are causing issues to you, you'd rather an AoE in that scenario to get rid of the other 2 who may be dealing debuffs onto your team. And that's my issue. I like Erudition, I like the concept of it. Follow-up attacks are cool, Lightning Lord is cool, but as of right now, Lightning Lord is kind of looking a bit bad. And follow-up attacks may be better in the future, but once again, it doesn't stop the fact that AoE is king as of right now. So I think that the paths don't matter and won't matter for a long time until we get another Erudition character and another Hunt character to adequately flesh out those rosters to a point to where it makes it worthwhile to invest into those classes. Because otherwise, just go farm destruction mats because every valuable character will be in that class. By the way, some of you liked it. I don't know, leave a like if you did, dislike if you don't. I don't mind. This was kind of a rant. I didn't really know what the point of this video was, but hey, I wanted to get it off my chest. Either way, I'll see you next time. Goodbye.